23 individuals on one Christmas morning. A choice that would send echoes across generations throughout Georgia. What unfolded at that plantation wasn't merely shocking. It was something that fundamentally challenged everything authorities believed they comprehended about loyalty, desperation, and what human beings will do when pushed beyond their limits. Here's the account of what those 23 souls did and why the complete truth required decades to finally surface. Before we continue exploring Riverside Plantation and the events that rattled Georgia to its foundation, if you're captivated by dark historical enigmas hovering between fact and legend, subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. You won't want to miss what follows. Now, let's journey back to 1847, to a location where silence guarded more secrets than words ever expressed. The Oconee River carved through middle Georgia, resembling a silver wound. Along its eastern bank rested Riverside Plantation, 3,000 acres of cotton fields, timber groves, and red clay earth that transformed into rust-colored mud every winter. The primary residence rose 3 stories tall, white pillars gleaming beneath the sun, a monument to prosperity constructed on the shoulders of those who would never cross its threshold. By December 1847, Riverside had remained in the Hartwell family for 42 years. James Hartwell III managed the operation with the same iron discipline his father and grandfather had practiced, though neighbors whispered he'd carried that discipline to extremes even his ancestors might have avoided. The plantation held 23 enslaved individuals, a fairly modest count compared to the enormous operations nearer Savannah, though Hartwell preferred it that way. Simpler to manage, he'd remark, simpler to monitor. The enslaved community at Riverside occupied a row of cabins behind the main house. Crude structures with openings in the walls that permitted winter drafts and summer heat alike. Each cabin measured roughly 12 feet by 14 feet, accommodating anywhere from 3 to 6 people, depending on family composition. The floors were compacted earth that turned muddy when rain seeped through the neglected roofs. A single fireplace in each cabin offered warmth and cooking space, though firewood was limited. During the chilliest months, people clustered together beneath worn blankets, their breath visible in the freezing air. There was Samuel, the eldest at 56, who'd been born on the property and remembered James Hartwell too. His hands were twisted from decades of cotton picking, his spine permanently curved from years bending in the fields, though his mind stayed sharp, and younger workers frequently sought his guidance on matters both practical and spiritual. Samuel had witnessed 3 generations of Hartwells, had observed the plantation expand from a modest operation to one of the county's more prosperous, and he comprehended the family's patterns and weaknesses better than they understood themselves. Ruth worked inside the main house, one of 3 individuals permitted beyond the white columns and polished floors. She was 38 years old, fair-skinned enough that whispers circulated regarding her parentage. Whispers that were likely accurate, given James Hartwell II's well-known tendencies. Ruth observed things the field workers never saw. The family arguments, the financial records left exposed on desks, the correspondence from creditors arriving with growing frequency. She caught conversations through doorways, gathered information that could prove valuable if one knew how to employ it. Her position provided access, though it also separated her from the cabin community, making her suspect to both the white family and her fellow enslaved workers. Thomas was barely 19, tall and powerful, with eyes containing a smoldering anger he'd mastered hiding behind a facade of obedience. His mother, Dinah, had been sold 3 years earlier to settle one of James Hartwell's gambling debts. Thomas had watched her being lifted onto a wagon, had heard her cries as she was carried away, and something inside him had fractured that day. He'd grown quieter, more withdrawn. Yet those who knew him well could perceive the fury accumulating beneath the surface like water behind a dam. There was also Esther, 42 years old, who served as the community's informal healer and midwife. She understood plants and roots, could ease suffering and reduce fevers, had delivered most of the children born on the plantation over the past 20 years. Her expertise made her valuable, though it also made Hartwell uneasy. He disliked things he couldn't comprehend or manage, and Esther's abilities fell into both categories. Benjamin and Clara were a married couple in their early 30s, parents to 3 children ranging from 4 to 11 years old. Benjamin worked as a carpenter, skilled enough that Hartwell occasionally hired him out to neighboring plantations, keeping the earnings for himself. Clara worked the fields during planting and harvest seasons, plus the main house kitchen during slower periods. They'd managed to preserve their family unit intact, an uncommon blessing within a system that routinely separated parents from children, husbands from wives. There was Moses, a quiet man of 40 who'd been acquired from a South Carolina plantation 5 years earlier. He'd arrived with scars across his back that told a story he never discussed, and a weariness in his eye suggesting he'd witnessed the worst the system could offer. He kept to himself mostly, though he was strong and dependable, and the other workers had gradually welcomed him into their community. Young Lily was 16, pretty in ways that made her susceptible to unwanted attention. Her mother, Sarah, watched her constantly, attempting to shield her from dangers that were terribly real. Sarah herself was 34, exhausted by years of field labor and the persistent anxiety of raising a daughter in a place where young women had no defense against the desires of white men. There was also Jacob, the blacksmith, whose abilities made him essential. He was 50 years old, powerfully built despite his years, with hands that could shape iron, and a mind that grasped mechanics and engineering. The plantation's tools, the iron fittings on wagons and buildings, the horseshoes and hinges, plus countless other metal necessities, all originated from Jacob's forge. Hartwell recognized Jacob's worth, which granted the blacksmith slightly more influence than most, though that influence was limited and perilous to exercise. The remaining community members included patients Hannah, Daniel, Elijah, Rebecca, Nathan, Grace, Joseph, Martha, Abigail, and Caleb. Each carrying their own histories, their own wounds, their own motives for what would unfold that Christmas morning. They ranged in age from 14 to 56, in skills from field hands to artisans. Yet they shared a common experience of existence under James Hartwell's authority, and that shared experience would ultimately unite them in an act that none could have undertaken individually. James Hartwell III was 41 years old during the winter of 1847, a man of average height with dark hair beginning to silver at the temples and pale blue eyes that appeared to look through people rather than at them. He'd inherited Riverside at age 23 when his father died from a stroke, and he'd managed it with an effectiveness that impressed his fellow planters, even as it disturbed some of them. Hartwell believed in discipline above all else, rigid timetables, severe punishments for violations, constant oversight to prevent what he termed laziness and disobedience. His wife Margaret was 36, a woman from a distinguished Savannah family who'd married Hartwell when she was 18. She'd borne him 4 children, though 2 had died in infancy, leaving a son of 12 and a daughter of 9. Margaret wasn't inherently cruel, but she'd been raised within a system that taught her to view enslaved people as property rather than humans, and she'd never seriously questioned that teaching. She managed the household with quiet competence, supervising the domestic workers and fulfilling the social obligations expected of a plantation mistress. The overseer, a man named Dutch Keller, occupied a small house near the eastern edge of the property. Dutch was 35, originally from Pennsylvania, who'd traveled south seeking opportunities and discovered work managing enslaved labor. He was neither the cruelest nor the kindest overseer in the county. He performed his duties with a businesslike detachment that some found more disturbing than outright brutality. He carried a whip, though used it sparingly, preferring psychological intimidation and the threat of punishment to constant physical violence. Yet when he did employ the whip, he employed it effectively, and everyone on the plantation understood this. The winter of 1847 had been particularly severe. An early October frost had damaged part of the cotton crop, blackening the bolls before they could be fully harvested. This loss represented a substantial financial setback for Hartwell, who'd borrowed heavily to expand his operations the previous year. This debt weighed on him, made him irritable and demanding. He responded to the crop loss by driving everyone harder, extending work hours, reducing rations, eliminating the small privileges that had made existence marginally more tolerable. By December, exhaustion had settled over the cabins like a physical weight. People moved more slowly, their bodies depleted by months of increased labor and diminished food. Injuries grew more frequent. A hand crushed in the cotton gin, a foot gashed by a carelessly handled tool, back strained by burdens too heavy. Esther did what she could with her herbs and poultices. Yet some injuries required rest to heal, and rest was something no one received. The psychological toll perhaps exceeded the physical one. A sense of hopelessness had crept into the community, a feeling that circumstances would never improve, that this grinding existence would continue until their bodies gave out. Some older workers spoke quietly about individuals they'd known who'd simply surrendered, who'd lost the will to continue fighting and had faded away despite having no apparent illness. That kind of death frightened people more than physical violence because it suggested the spirit could be broken even when the body remained intact. Christmas had always been different at Riverside, though not in a positive way. Most Georgia plantations granted their enslaved workers a few days of rest during the holiday. A brief respite that served as much to sustain productivity as to observe tradition. The reasoning was straightforward. People who received occasional breaks worked harder throughout the rest of the year, and the Christmas holiday offered a release valve for tensions that might otherwise accumulate to dangerous levels. Yet James Hartwell held his own views about Christmas. He believed idleness fostered rebellion, that any interruption in routine created opportunities for scheming and planning. He'd observed what occurred on other plantations where workers were given time off. They assembled, they talked, they remembered they were human beings with thoughts and desires beyond their labor. Hartwell found this threatening, so he'd established his own tradition. Christmas at Riverside was a working day like any other, with perhaps a somewhat larger meal in the evening as the sole concession to the holiday. This policy had created tension with his neighbors, some of whom believed he was being unnecessarily severe. Even other slaveholders, men with no moral objections to the institution itself, thought Hartwell was pushing too far, creating risks that weren't worth the marginal increase in productivity. Yet Hartwell dismissed their concerns. He understood his property, he'd say. He understood what was necessary to preserve control. On Christmas Eve of 1847, Hartwell made an announcement that would prove the final provocation. He assembled everyone in the yard between the cabins and the main house. All 23 enslaved workers, plus Dutch Keller and Margaret, who observed from the porch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the red clay, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as night approached. Hartwell stood on the porch steps, elevated above the gathered group, and spoke in a voice that carried distinctly in the cold air. Tomorrow, he announced, there would be no rest. Instead, they would begin clearing a new field on the eastern edge of the property. Work that would demand every able body from dawn until well after dark. The new field was necessary because of the crop loss, he explained. They needed to expand cultivation to compensate for the shortfall, and the work needed to start immediately to have the land ready for spring planting. He continued detailing the expectations. They would clear brush and small trees, remove rocks, begin the process of preparing the soil. It was demanding labor, the kind that would leave people exhausted and aching, and performing it in December's cold would make it even harder. Yet Hartwell made clear he expected full effort from everyone, and that any shirking would be punished severely. When he finished, he went back inside without waiting for any response. There was never any response expected. The people in the yard stood silently for a moment, absorbing what they'd just heard, then slowly dispersed to their cabins as darkness fell and the temperature continued dropping. That night, something shifted within the cabins. It wasn't an abrupt change, not a dramatic moment of decision, but rather a gradual convergence of individual frustrations into collective understanding. People moved between cabins despite the cold, gathering in small clusters, speaking in low tones that wouldn't carry to the main house or to Dutch Keller's residence. Samuel, who rarely discussed the old days, began sharing stories about his mother, about traditions she'd preserved even in bondage. He spoke about resistance, not the violent kind that resulted in hangings and brutal retaliation, but the quiet kind that preserved dignity and humanity in the face of dehumanization. He talked about the importance of community, of standing together, of remembering they were people, not property, regardless of what the law stated. Ruth, who typically kept to herself, moved between the cabins with a purpose others noticed but didn't question. She carried information, things she'd overheard in the main house, details about Hartwell's financial difficulties, knowledge about the family's vulnerabilities. She didn't explicitly suggest what should be done with this information, but she made sure people knew it, understood the complete picture of their situation. Thomas sat outside his cabin despite the cold, staring at the main house with an expression that made the older workers uncomfortable. His anger was palpable, barely contained, and there was concern he might do something rash, something that would bring violence upon the entire community. Yet when people approached him, tried to calm him down, they discovered his anger had crystallized into something colder and more calculated. He wasn't interested in violence, he told them. Violence would achieve nothing except getting people killed. Yet there were other ways to resist, other ways to make Hartwell comprehend what he'd done. Esther moved through the cabins with her medicine bag, tending to injuries and illnesses, but also listening, observing, understanding the mood that was building. She'd witnessed this before years ago on a different plantation. She knew it could proceed in several directions, toward violence, toward despair, or toward something else. Something demanding courage and coordination, and a willingness to risk everything for a chance at dignity. Benjamin and Clara gathered their children close, speaking to them in whispers about the importance of family, of staying together regardless of what happened. The children didn't fully understand what was being discussed, but they sensed the tension, the feeling that something significant was about to occur. Moses, the quiet man from South Carolina, finally spoke about his past. He told about a plantation where he'd witnessed people pushed too far, where desperation had led to a violent uprising that had been crushed with overwhelming force. He'd survived that uprising, carried the scars to prove it, and he wanted everyone to understand what occurred when resistance turned violent. The authorities didn't distinguish between leaders and followers, between those who'd fought and those who'd merely been present. Everyone suffered. Everyone paid the price. If they were going to resist, he said, it had to be intelligent. Had to be something that couldn't be easily crushed with guns and dogs and the full weight of the law. Jacob, the blacksmith, talked about leverage. He understood power dynamics, understood that Hartwell's control depended on their cooperation, their labor, their willingness to accept their assigned roles. What if they simply stopped cooperating? What if they refused to play their parts in the system? It would be dangerous, certainly, yet it might also prove effective in ways violence could never achieve. The conversations continued. Through the night, moving from cabin to cabin, involving everyone in the community. There were disagreements, certainly. Some people believed any resistance was too dangerous, that they should simply endure as they'd always endured. Others wanted more dramatic action, wanted to strike back in ways that would hurt Hartwell as much as he'd hurt them. Yet gradually, through hours of discussion and debate, a consensus emerged. They would resist, though not with violence. They would make a stand, though not one that would provide authorities an excuse to destroy them. They would do something never done before, something that would force Hartwell and everyone else to recognize them as human beings making choices, not as malfunctioning property. The plan that emerged was simple in concept, yet would demand extraordinary courage and discipline to execute. On Christmas morning, when the bell rang summoning them to work, they would gather in the yard as usual. Then, instead of proceeding to the new field, they would simply stand there. They wouldn't work. They wouldn't speak. They wouldn't make demands or issue threats. They would simply stand silently, refusing to move, refusing to cooperate, forcing Hartwell to confront the reality that his control was an illusion dependent on their consent. It was a plan that could easily fail, that could lead to violence and suffering. Yet it was also a plan that preserved their dignity, that made a statement about their humanity without providing authorities an easy excuse for brutal retaliation. If they were going to resist, this was how they would do it. Not as violent rebels, but as human beings asserting their right to be seen and heard. As the night wore on and the temperature continued dropping, the 23 made their decision. Each person had to choose individually. No one could be forced or pressured into participating. Yet one by one they agreed. They would stand together on Christmas morning. They would face whatever consequences came. And they would do it as a community, supporting each other, refusing to let Hartwell break them individually. The temperature dropped as midnight approached. Frost formed on the cabin roofs, glittering in the moonlight like shattered glass. Inside the main house, James Hartwell slept in his second-floor bedroom, his wife Margaret in the room beside his, their 2 children in the nursery down the hall. The house was quiet, warm, insulated from the December cold by thick walls and heavy curtains. Hartwell had no idea what was being planned in the cabins behind his house. No sense that morning would bring something that would change everything. Christmas morning arrived with a pale grey light that transformed the frost-covered fields into something almost beautiful. The air remained still and cold, so cold that breath emerged in thick clouds, and exposed skin stung within seconds. The bell that usually rang at 5 to wake the workers remained silent, not because of any decision by Hartwell, but because Dutch Keller, who normally rang it, had overslept slightly, disrupted by the holiday. In the cabins, people were already awake. They'd slept little, if at all, and now they prepared themselves for what was coming. They dressed in their warmest clothing, meager as those were. They gathered in small groups, offering each other quiet words of encouragement. Samuel led a prayer, asking for strength and courage, asking that whatever happened, they would face it together. At 5:30, Dutch Keller finally rang the bell, the sound cutting through the cold morning air. Normally, people would emerge from their cabins quickly, knowing delays meant punishment. Yet this morning they emerged slowly, deliberately gathering in the yard between the cabins and the main house. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle facing the house, and then they simply stood there waiting. Dutch Keller noticed immediately that something was wrong. The usual morning routine, people gathering their tools, organizing into work groups, preparing for the day's labor, wasn't happening. Instead, everyone was simply standing there, silent and still, their faces calm, yet their eyes alert. Dutch approached them, demanded to know what was happening, why they weren't preparing for work. No one answered. No one even looked directly at him. They simply stood there, their silence more unsettling than any words could have been. Dutch went to the main house, climbed the porch steps, and knocked on the door. It took several minutes for anyone to answer. The household was just waking, and Christmas morning, even at Riverside, usually started slightly later than other days. Finally, Margaret opened the door, still in her nightgown and robe, her hair unpinned. Dutch explained the situation, his voice tight with tension. Margaret's face went pale, and she immediately went upstairs to wake her husband. James Hartwell dressed quickly, descended the stairs, and stepped onto the front porch. The sight greeting him would become the subject of countless retellings, each version slightly different, yet all agreeing on the essential facts. 23 people stood in the yard between the cabins and the main house. They weren't working. They weren't moving. They were simply standing, arranged in a loose semicircle facing the house. Their hands were empty. Their faces were calm, and they were completely, utterly silent. For a moment, Hartwell simply stared, trying to process what he was seeing. Then his face flushed red and he began shouting. He demanded they get to work immediately. He threatened punishments. Whipping, reduced rations, sail to the deep south where conditions were even harsher. His voice echoed across the yard, bouncing off the cabins and fading into the cotton fields beyond. The 23 people didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply stood there watching him with expressions revealing nothing. Hartwell's first response was anger. The reflexive fury of a man whose authority had been challenged. He shouted orders, demanded explanations, threatened consequences that would make them regret this defiance. He called out individual names, trying to break the collective silence by isolating single voices. Samuel, you're the oldest here. Tell me what this is about. Silence. Ruth, you work in my house. You know better than this. Silence. Thomas, are you behind this? Is this your doing? Silence. The silence was absolute, unbroken, and it was more unnerving than any shouted defiance would have been. Hartwell was accustomed to resistance he could understand. People who talked back, who argued, who expressed their anger in ways that justified his punishments. Yet this silent refusal to engage, this collective withdrawal of cooperation was something he had no framework for understanding. Margaret Hartwell appeared at the door behind her husband, drawn by his shouting. She took in the scene, the 23 people standing silently in the yard, her husband's red face and clenched fists, the tension that seemed to thicken the cold air, and immediately retreated back inside. She gathered the children and took them upstairs, away from whatever was about to happen. She understood, perhaps before her husband did, that something fundamental had shifted, that the normal rules and patterns no longer applied. For 3 hours, the standoff continued. Hartwell alternated between threats and promises, between rage and forced calm. He tried everything he could think of to break the silence. He promised better treatment if they returned to work immediately. He threatened to sell them all, to break up families, to make their lives so miserable they'd beg for mercy. He appealed to individuals he thought might be more susceptible to pressure. He tried reasoning, explaining the economic necessities requiring their labor. Nothing worked. The sun rose higher, burning off the frost, and still the 23 held their ground. Dutch Keller stood on the porch beside Hartwell, his hand resting on the whip at his belt, yet he made no move to use it. He understood, perhaps better than Hartwell, that violence at this moment would be a mistake. The group wasn't threatening anyone, wasn't destroying property, wasn't doing anything that clearly justified brutal retaliation. They were simply standing there, and attacking them for that would make Hartwell appear the aggressor, would create sympathy for them that might spread to other plantations. Around 9, Hartwell sent Dutch to fetch the sheriff from the county seat. Dutch saddled a horse and rode hard, covering the 12 miles in less than an hour. Sheriff William Crawford was at home with his family preparing for a Christmas meal when Dutch arrived with news of the situation at Riverside. Crawford listened to Dutch's description, asked a few questions, then gathered 3 deputies and rode back with Dutch to the plantation. Sheriff William Crawford arrived at Riverside shortly after 11. He was a man in his early 50s, heavy-set, with grey hair and a face weathered by years of outdoor work. He'd been sheriff for 15 years, had dealt with runaway slaves and minor rebellions before, and he approached the situation with a mixture of caution and confidence. He expected to find something requiring force to resolve, armed resistance perhaps, or property destruction that would justify arrests and harsh punishment. What Crawford found instead was something that unsettled him more than outright rebellion would have. The enslaved workers weren't armed. They hadn't destroyed property or threatened violence. They hadn't even spoken. They were simply refusing to work, refusing to acknowledge the authority that had governed their entire lives. It was passive resistance before that term existed, and it terrified the white men witnessing it because they had no framework for understanding it. Crawford dismounted and approached the group, keeping his voice level and his hand away from his weapon. He was known as a reasonable man by the standards of his time and place, someone who preferred talk to violence when possible. He'd built his reputation on diffusing tense situations, finding solutions, avoiding bloodshed while still maintaining social order. "I'm Sheriff Crawford," he said, addressing the group as a whole since no individual had been identified as a leader. "I need to understand what's happening here. What do you want? What would end this standoff?" The silence greeting him was absolute. 23 pairs of eyes watched him, yet not a single mouth opened to respond. Crawford tried again, using a different approach. "I know Christmas is a hard day to work. Most places give folks time off. Maybe Mr. Hartwell could reconsider. Give you the day to rest and we can all move past this." Still nothing. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, oppressive. Crawford looked back at Hartwell, who stood on the porch with arms crossed, his face still flushed with anger. "James, maybe we should talk about this. Maybe there's a compromise here." Hartwell's response was immediate and sharp. "There's no compromise. They work or they face the consequences. I won't be dictated to buy my own property." Crawford winced at the phrasing, not out of moral objection, but because he understood Hartwell's attitude was worsening the situation. The sheriff had handled enough tense situations to know rigid positions led to violence. Violence here would be a disaster. Even if they could force the workers back to labor, and he wasn't sure they could without killing some of them, the story would spread. Other plantations would hear about it. Enslaved communities throughout the county would learn resistance was possible, that collective action could challenge the system. That was a precedent Crawford desperately wanted to avoid. By afternoon, word had spread to neighboring plantations. Other owners arrived, some out of curiosity, others concerned that whatever was happening at Riverside might spread to their own properties. They gathered on Hartwell's porch, discussing options in low voices, while the 23 maintained their vigil in the yard. The plantation owners arriving represented a cross-section of the county's elite. There was Robert Finch, who owned a large plantation to the north and was known for relatively lenient treatment of his workers. He gave them Christmas off, allowed small garden plots, and rarely used physical punishment. There was Thomas Gaines, whose plantation to the south was run with discipline nearly as harsh as Hartwell's. There was William Prescott, an older man who'd inherited his plantation and ran it more from tradition than passion. And there were several others, each bringing their own perspectives and concerns. The discussion on the porch was heated. Finch argued Hartwell should simply give them the day off, let them have their Christmas rest, and deal with discipline issues later. "You're creating a situation that doesn't need to exist," he told Hartwell. "Give them what they want today and tomorrow you can reassert control. But if you push this to violence, you'll regret it." Gaines disagreed. "If we yield to this, we're finished. Every plantation in the county will face the same thing. They'll learn if they just stand there and refuse to work, we'll cave. We have to make an example here. Show them this kind of behavior has consequences." Prescott, the older man, offered a different perspective. "I've been doing this for 40 years and I've never seen anything quite like this. They're not rebelling in the traditional sense. They're not violent. They're just refusing. I don't know what the right response is, but I know whatever we do here will be remembered. We need to think carefully." The debate continued for hours with no consensus emerging. Some owners were genuinely concerned about the precedent this would set. Others were more worried about practical implications if this spread to their plantations. How would they maintain productivity? How would they keep control? The system they'd built their lives and fortunes on depended on compliance. On acceptance by enslaved people of their assigned roles. What happened when that acceptance was withdrawn? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, something remarkable happened. Enslaved workers from 2 neighboring plantations, people given Christmas Day off, began arriving at Riverside. They didn't join the silent protest, but positioned themselves at the property's edges, watching. Their presence added a new dimension to the standoff, a suggestion that what was happening here resonated beyond these 23 individuals. The watchers from other plantations didn't speak or interfere. They simply stood at the property boundaries, their presence a silent statement of solidarity or curiosity or both. Their masters noticed immediately and were deeply unsettled. This was exactly what they'd feared. Spread of the idea, the sense that what was happening at Riverside mattered to enslaved people throughout the region. The temperature dropped with approaching darkness. Margaret Hartwell, watching from an upstairs window, made a decision. She had food and water brought out and placed in the yard within reach of the 23. It was a gesture of basic humanity, an acknowledgement that whatever was happening, these were still people needing sustenance, yet the food and water were refused. The 23 didn't move toward it, didn't acknowledge it. They maintained their positions, their silence, their collective refusal to engage. Sheriff's deputies built a fire near the main house, trying to stay warm. As night closed in, plantation owners who'd gathered earlier began leaving, heading back to their own properties with stories that would grow in the telling. Watchers at property edges slowly dispersed as darkness fell, though some remained, their presence marked by small fires they built against the cold. Still the 23 stood in the yard, silent and unmoving, their breath visible in the cold air like spirits leaving bodies. They'd been standing more than 12 hours now, and physical toll was evident. Some swayed slightly, fighting exhaustion. Others shifted weight foot to foot, trying to maintain circulation in the cold, yet no one broke ranks. No one spoke. No one gave Hartwell satisfaction of seeing them falter. Just when we thought we'd seen everything, horror at Riverside intensifies. If this story sends chills through you, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button supporting our content. Don't forget to subscribe, never missing stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. What happened next would become the source of greatest controversy, the detail argued over in courtrooms and newspapers for months to come. Around 7, as full darkness settled over the plantation, James Hartwell made a decision. He went into his house, climbed to the second floor, and retrieved a rifle from his study. It was a well-maintained weapon, a hunting rifle used for deer and other game, and he loaded it with practiced efficiency. When he returned to the porch, rifle in hands changed atmosphere immediately. Deputies tensed. Few remaining plantation owners who'd stayed to see resolution exchanged worried glances. Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, hand raised in calming gesture. "James, let's think about this. Let's not do anything we'll regret." Hartwell didn't respond to the sheriff. He raised the weapon, pointed skyward, and fired a single shot into air. Sound shattered silence like glass breaking, echoing across plantation and into surrounding woods. Birds erupted from trees, horses in stable whinnied alarm, and for a moment everything froze. Sheriff and his deputies, remaining plantation owners, watchers at property's edges, then slowly, deliberately, the 23 people in yard turned and walked back to their cabins. They didn't run. They didn't speak. They simply withdrew, leaving yard empty except for marks their feet had made in frost-softened ground. They moved as a group, maintaining collective cohesion even in retreat, and disappeared into cabins, closing doors behind them. Hartwell lowered his rifle, face flushed with what might have been triumph or relief or something more complicated. He declared situation resolved and invited other owners inside for drinks. They accepted, though several appeared troubled, uncertain whether what they'd witnessed represented victory or something else entirely. Sheriff and deputies remained outside, uneasy about resolution, but unsure what else to do. Crawford approached cabins, intending to speak with someone to understand what had happened and whether it was truly over. But when he knocked on doors, no one answered. Cabins were silent, dark, giving no indication of what was happening inside. Watchers from neighboring plantations slowly dispersed, heading back to their own homes with stories that would grow in telling. By morning, everyone in county would know something had happened at Riverside, though details would vary depending on who was telling story. Inside main house, Hartwell poured whiskey for guests and tried projecting confidence. He'd handled situation, he insisted. He'd shown them who was in control. Tomorrow things would return to normal and this whole incident would be forgotten. But even as he spoke, there was brittleness to his confidence, a sense he was trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Margaret Hartwell stayed upstairs with children, unwilling to participate in husband's celebration. She'd watched entire day unfold from her window, had seen silent standoff, had witnessed husband's increasing desperation, and she understood something had broken. System they'd lived under, assumptions they'd made about control and authority had been challenged in ways that couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten. In cabins, the 23 gathered in Samuel's cabin, largest of structures. They spoke in whispers, processing what happened, discussing what would come next. They'd made their stand, maintained it more than 12 hours, and withdrawn on their own terms rather than being forced back to work. It wasn't complete victory. They'd still work tomorrow, would still be enslaved, would still face Hartwell's authority. But they'd proven something important. They could act collectively, could resist in ways not giving authorities easy justification for brutal reprisal, could force white men claiming to own them to see them as human beings making choices. Yet they also understood consequences would follow. Hartwell wouldn't simply forget what happened. He would find ways punishing them, reasserting control, making sure they understood their act of resistance had costs. Question was what form those consequences would take and whether directed at individuals or community as whole. Samuel, speaking in low measured tones commanding respect, reminded everyone of what they'd accomplished. "We stood together," he said. "For 12 hours we stood as one. They couldn't break us. They couldn't make us speak. They couldn't force us back to work. That matters. That will be remembered." Ruth added her own perspective. "I've been in that house for years and I've never seen Mr. Hartwell like he was today. He was frightened. Underneath all that anger, he was scared because he realized his control isn't absolute. We showed him that." Thomas, young man whose anger had been concern, spoke with surprising calm. "My mother was taken from me because Mr. Hartwell needed money. He sold her like she was furniture. Today, we showed him we're not furniture. We're people, and people can choose not to cooperate. Conversation continued late into night with everyone contributing thoughts and feelings about what happened. There was pride in accomplishment, but also anxiety about what would come next. They'd crossed line, challenged system in ways that couldn't be undone, and they knew Hartwell would respond. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that real resistance was just beginning, and Christmas morning standoff would be remembered not as climax of story, but as opening act. Morning after Christmas, bell rang at 5 as usual. Field workers were expected to begin clearing project postponed. But when Dutch Keller went to cabins rousing workers, he found them empty, not abandoned. Personal belongings remained, few possessions each person owned still in places. Blankets neatly folded. Small carved figures and precious items arranged carefully on shelves, but people themselves were gone. All 23 had vanished in night. Dutch stood in doorway of Samuel's cabin, staring at empty space, trying to process what he was seeing. He checked each cabin in turn, finding same thing in each. Empty, but not ransacked. Everything orderly, peaceful, as if occupants had simply stepped out momentarily and would return shortly. But Dutch knew they weren't coming back. Somehow, impossibly, 23 people had disappeared from guarded plantation without leaving any trace of departure. He ran to main house, pounding on door with enough force waking entire household. James Hartwell appeared at door in nightshirt, hair disheveled, face still heavy with sleep. "What is it?" he demanded, irritated at being woken so early. "They're gone," Dutch said, voice tight with tension. "All of them. Every single one. Cabins are empty." Hartwell's face went from irritation to confusion to fury in space of seconds. He pushed past Dutch and ran to cabins, checking each himself, as if Dutch might have somehow missed 23 people. But cabins were indeed empty, and reality of situation began sinking in. Discovery sent Hartwell into fury his wife would later describe as frightening in intensity. He immediately organized search party, pulling together every available man from Riverside and sending word to surrounding plantations for help. Sheriff Crawford was summoned again, this time bringing larger force and pack of tracking dogs. Search began at dawn and continued through day, covering woods surrounding plantation, banks of Oconee River, roads leading to nearby towns. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of passage, no indication which direction group had gone. Tracking dogs were brought to cabins, given items with missing workers sent, and set loose finding trail. But dogs circled cabins whining in confusion and couldn't pick up any trail leading away from plantation. It was as if 23 people had simply dissolved into winter air, leaving behind only mystery of departure. Search expanded over following days. Patrols established on all major roads. River crossings watched. Notices posted in towns throughout Middle Georgia describing missing workers and offering substantial rewards for information. Hartwell hired additional men scouring countryside, convinced group that large couldn't simply disappear without leaving some trace. Descriptions in notices were detailed. Samuel, 56 years old, bent back, graying hair. Ruth, 38, light-skinned, worked in main house. Thomas, 19, tall and strong. Each of 23 described in terms reducing them to physical characteristics and monetary value, language of property rather than people. Rewards offered were significant, enough money tempting anyone with possible information. But weeks passed with no discoveries. Cabins at Riverside remained empty, doors hanging open, interiors slowly accumulating dust and dead leaves blown in by winter winds. Plantations work continued with hired laborers and workers borrowed from neighboring properties, but absence of 23 hung over everything like question refusing answer. Theories proliferated throughout county and beyond. Some believed group had been helped by abolitionists spirited away on Underground Railroad rumored having routes through Georgia, though most of those routes ran much further north, and logistics of moving 23 people at once seemed nearly impossible. Others suggested they'd fled to swamps of southern Georgia, where fugitives could hide for years in trackless wetlands, living off land and avoiding detection. A few whispered darker possibilities that they'd been murdered by someone, bodies hidden where never found, though who would have done this and why remained unclear. James Hartwell became obsessed with finding them. He spent enormous sums on search, hiring professional slave catchers and investigators, following leads that inevitably led nowhere. His behavior grew erratic. Workers on plantation reported hearing him walking grounds at night, calling out names, demanding answers from darkness. He would stand in empty cabins, staring at abandoned possessions, trying to understand how this had happened under his watch. His wife grew concerned enough, writing to his brother in Savannah, asking for help managing both plantation and husband's deteriorating state. Brother came for visit in late January, spent week at Riverside and left deeply troubled by what he'd seen. James had lost weight, wasn't sleeping, and had developed paranoid edge, making him difficult around. He was convinced someone knew where 23 had gone, that conspiracy of silence protected them, and he interrogated anyone coming to plantation with intensity bordering on madness. Financial impact of disappearance was significant. 23 workers represented substantial investment, and loss came at time when Hartwell was already struggling with debt from previous year's crop failure. He'd borrowed money purchasing several workers, and those debts remained even though workers were gone. Insurance didn't cover runaways, and there was no legal recourse recovering losses. Plantation's productivity dropped sharply, and Hartwell was forced borrowing more money, hiring replacement labor, digging himself deeper into financial trouble. Then, in late February, discovery was made that would deepen mystery rather than solve it. A farmer named Josiah Perkins, clearing land about 8 miles from Riverside, found something buried in shallow depression near creek. It was a collection of items, 23 small bundles, each carefully wrapped in cloth and tied with string. Perkins, curious, opened one bundle and found carved wooden figure, kind of thing child might play with or adult might keep as memento. Perkins brought items to sheriff, who immediately recognized potential significance. Crawford brought bundles to Riverside, where Margaret Hartwell and Dutch Keller examined them. Several were immediately identifiable. There was Samuel's carving, small figure of man he'd worked on for years, adding details and refinements. There was piece of cloth with careful stitching Ruth recognized as belonging to her sister. There was smooth river stone Thomas had carried since childhood, gift from mother before she was sold away. Each bundle contained something personal, something precious, something treasured by owner. Discovery raised more questions than answers. Why would people fleeing for lives take time burying most precious possessions? What did burial signify? And how had they managed doing this without detection? Location where bundles were found was a long route search parties had covered multiple times. Yet no one had noticed any signs of recent digging or disturbance. Local minister, Reverend Elijah Thorne, was consulted about discovery. He suggested it might be ritual of some kind, symbolic leaving behind of old lives. Many African traditions, he explained, involved burial of significant objects marking transitions or transformations. Perhaps the 23 had performed such ritual before fleeing, marking departure from slavery and journey toward freedom. Yet that explanation satisfied no one. If they were starting new lives elsewhere, why not take these items with them? These were most precious possessions, things connecting them to past, to families, to identities. Why bury them in random location miles from plantation? And why bury them together in single cache rather than each person disposing of own items? Hartwell became fixated on burial site. He visited it repeatedly, sometimes spending hours there, staring at ground as if it might yield secrets through sheer force of will. He had area excavated more thoroughly, hoping finding additional clues, but nothing else discovered. Bundles remained only physical evidence of where 23 had gone and what they'd done after leaving Riverside. Spring arrived, bringing demands and distractions. Plantation needed preparing for planting, and Hartwell was forced focusing on practical matters. Even as obsession with missing workers continued consuming him, he hired more workers, both enslaved people purchased from other plantations and free laborers needing work. But new workers were uneasy at Riverside, sensing something wrong in empty cabins and employers' erratic behavior. In May, there was potential breakthrough. traveling merchant passing through county claimed seeing group matching description of missing workers in Tennessee working on farm owned by Quaker family known for abolitionist sympathies. Hartwell immediately traveled to Tennessee, bringing Sheriff Crawford and 2 deputies. They found workers there who'd clearly escaped from slavery, but none were from Riverside. Merchant, it turned out, had been mistaken or had been seeking reward money with false information. Failed trip to Tennessee seemed breaking something in Hartwell. He returned to Riverside, more withdrawn, less vocal about determination finding missing workers. He continued plantation's operations, but with mechanical efficiency suggesting he was going through motions rather than truly engaging with work. Margaret noticed change and was relieved, hoping husband was finally accepting loss and moving on. But she also noticed he still walked grounds at night, still stood in empty cabins, still seemed waiting for something. Summer passed, then fall. Cotton crop that year was mediocre. Not disaster, but not profitable enough, significantly reducing Hartwell's debts. He sold off some land raising cash, reducing plantation size for first time in 3 generations. Neighbors noticed decline and whispered about it, some with sympathy, others with satisfaction from seeing proud man brought low. In August, traveling preacher passing through area claimed having information about missing workers. He said he'd encountered group matching their description in Alabama working on plantation owned by man asking no questions about where workers came from. Hartwell paid preacher for information and sent Dutch Keller investigating. Dutch traveled to Alabama, found plantation, but once again, none of workers there were from Riverside. Pattern repeated itself over following months. Someone would claim seeing missing workers. Hartwell would pay for information or send someone investigating, and lead would prove false. Each disappointment took toll, wearing away at Hartwell's health and sanity. By winter of 1848, year after Christmas morning standoff, he was shadow of man he'd been. He'd lost weight. Hair had gone almost completely grey, and he moved with careful deliberation of someone much older than 42 years. Years passed. Civil War came and went, bringing upheavals and transformations. Riverside Plantation survived war, but never fully recovered antebellum prosperity. Emancipation Proclamation and Union victory ended slavery, transforming entire economic and social system plantations had been built on. James Hartwell died in 1869 at age 63, obsession with missing 23 unresolved. Death certificate listed cause as heart failure, but those knowing him in final years understood he'd been dying slowly for over 20 years, consumed by mystery he couldn't solve. His wife sold property and moved to Atlanta, wanting escaping memories haunting every corner of land. Plantation was purchased by family named Patterson, originally from Pennsylvania, who'd come south after war, seeking opportunities in disrupted economy. They hired freedmen working land, paying wages instead of owning people, trying building something new from ruins of old system. Among workers was elderly man named Samuel, who'd shown up one day in spring of 1872 asking employment. He was in early 80s by then, back more bent than ever, hands twisted with arthritis, but he proved knowledgeable about cotton cultivation and specific characteristics of riverside soil. Patterson's hired him, giving light duties appropriate for age, and he became fixture on plantation, respected by other workers and valued by employers. It took 3 years before anyone made connection. Former neighbor visiting Patterson's in summer of 1875 recognized Samuel as one of missing 23. Revelation sparked immediate interest. Where had he been? What had happened to others? How had they managed disappearing so completely? Samuel, now in mid-80s, agreed telling story, but only on his own terms. He gathered small group, Patterson's, lawyer from county seat named Marcus Brennan, and journalist from Atlanta named Henry Whitfield, who'd heard about case and traveled to Riverside investigating. On cold December evening in 1875, exactly 28 years after Christmas morning standoff, Samuel finally broke silence. They met in main house at Riverside in same room where James Hartwell had once entertained plantation owners who'd come witnessing standoff. Samuel sat in comfortable chair by fireplace, blanket over legs, and began speaking in voice quiet but clear, telling story challenging everything people thought they understood about disappearance. What Samuel revealed that night would become one of most remarkable stories of resistance in American history. The 23 hadn't fled north. They hadn't been murdered or hidden in swamps. They'd been at Riverside entire time. Plantation, Samuel explained, had something most people didn't know about. Network of old storage cellars and tunnels beneath main house and several outbuildings. They'd been built by James Hartwell II during War of 1812, intended as hiding places for valuables in case of British invasion. Cellars accessed through concealed entrances in floors of certain buildings, and they connected to each other through narrow tunnels dug through red clay soil. Over decades, cellars had been largely forgotten. James Hartwell III knew they existed. He'd been shown them as child. But he rarely thought about them and never used them. New construction and accumulated debris had concealed some entrances, and cellars had become just another forgotten feature of old plantation. But Samuel had known about them. His mother, who'd worked in main house during James Hartwell II's time, had shown him cellars when he was boy. She'd explained they were secret places, that knowledge should be kept within enslaved community, passed carefully from generation to generation. Samuel had kept knowledge, had shown cellars to few trusted people over years, and had always understood they might someday be useful. On Christmas night, after Hartwell fired rifle, and everyone retreated to cabins, the 23 had gathered in darkness and made decision. They would disappear, but not by fleeing. They would hide beneath plantation itself, living in cellars and tunnels, and they would watch what happened when James Hartwell realized property had vanished. They'd been preparing for weeks, Samuel explained. Ever since Hartwell announced no Christmas rest, they'd been gathering supplies and planning. Ruth had stolen food from main house kitchen in small quantities unnoticed. Jacob had quietly set aside tools and materials. Esther had collected herbs and medicines. Benjamin had prepared cellars, clearing debris and making habitable. By Christmas night, everything ready. Entrances to cellars were in several locations. One in floor of old storage shed rarely used. Another beneath loose floorboard in barn. Third hidden under pile of firewood near blacksmith's forge. The 23 had slipped into cellars in small groups throughout Christmas night, moving silently through darkness, and by dawn they were all underground, hidden beneath very plantation searching for them. Journalist Henry Whitfield interrupted at this point, asking obvious question, why? Why hide beneath plantation instead of actually fleeing? Why take such enormous risk when they could have used same planning and coordination escaping north? Samuel's answer was simple and devastating. They'd wanted seeing what would happen. They'd wanted watching James Hartwell destroy himself searching for them. They'd wanted him understanding in most visceral way possible what it felt like losing control over people he considered property. And they'd wanted proving to themselves they could resist, could exercise agency and make choices even in most oppressive circumstances. For 3 months, Samuel continued, they'd lived in those tunnels. Conditions were difficult. Cellars cold, damp, and dark. They had to ration supplies carefully, making food and water last as long as possible. They couldn't make noise during day when people might hear them. They had to manage waste and maintain hygiene in confined spaces. It was uncomfortable, often miserable, but also empowering in ways none had experienced before. They'd emerged only at night, moving through darkness gathering additional food and water, breathing fresh air, maintaining strength. Main house had several entrances to cellars, and they'd used these accessing kitchen and storage areas. They'd watched through concealed openings as Hartwell raged and searched and slowly fell apart. They'd listened to his nighttime wanderings, shouted demands for answers. And they'd felt something denied them entire lives. Power. Ruth had been particularly valuable during this time, Samuel explained. Her knowledge of main house, understanding of families' routines, allowed them moving through building without detection. She'd known which floorboards creaked, which doors kept locked, which rooms used at which times. She'd guided others through house at night, showing them taking what they needed without leaving obvious traces. Buried items, Samuel explained, had been message, way of saying they'd left old lives behind without actually leaving land. It was symbolic and practical at once, ritual marking transformation from property to people making choices. They'd buried items together in location without particular significance because act itself mattered, not location. Marcus Brennan, lawyer, asked about logistics. How had they coordinated movements? How had they avoided detection for so long? Samuel smiled, rare expression transforming weathered face, and explained it required careful planning and discipline. They'd established rules. No one moved alone. Everyone had partner noticing if something went wrong. They'd created schedules for when different people would emerge, ensuring cellars never completely empty in case someone needed hiding quickly. They developed signals, patterns of knocks and taps allowing communication through floors and walls. Most dangerous moments, Samuel said, had come when search parties walked directly over hiding places. They'd heard footsteps above, voices of men searching, and they'd had to remain absolutely silent, barely breathing. Terrified sound might give them away. But searchers had never thought looking beneath buildings, never imagined missing workers might be hiding right under feet. In late March, when search finally died down and Hartwell's attention turned elsewhere, the 23 had begun leaving in small groups. 2 or 3 at a time, spacing departures over several weeks. They'd slipped away from Riverside and made way to various destinations. Some had gone north, using underground railroad routes existing, though dangerous and uncertain. Some had gone to cities where they could disappear into free black communities, taking new names and building new lives. Some, like Samuel, had eventually returned to Georgia, waiting until enough time passed that they could live openly without fear of connection to disappearance. Henry Whitfield asked about others. Where were they now? Were they still alive? Samuel's expression became guarded. He wouldn't reveal that information, he said. Some secrets needed keeping. Some people deserve living lives without being defined by what they'd done on one Christmas morning in 1847. He'd agreed telling own story because he was old, because people who might punish him were dead, and because he wanted truth known, but he wouldn't betray others, wouldn't expose them to potential consequences even decades after. Fact. Story Samuel told that night was published in Atlanta Constitution in January of 1876. It caused sensation, not just in Georgia but throughout South and North. Some called it hoax, insisting Samuel was lying or confused, story too incredible being true. Others saw it as powerful symbol of resistance, demonstration enslaved people had found ways fighting back beyond violent rebellions terrifying white Southerners for generations. Investigators were sent to Riverside verifying Samuel's claims about tunnels. They found them exactly as described, network of underground spaces beneath main house and outbuildings with concealed entrances carefully maintained despite supposed abandonment. Evidence of recent habitation found. Makeshift beds from old blankets, empty food containers, even few personal items matching descriptions of belongings owned by missing 23. Physical evidence confirmed Samuel's story, silencing most skeptics. Discovery of tunnels and confirmation of Samuel's account forced re-evaluation of what happened at Riverside. This wasn't just story of people fleeing slavery. It was story of psychological warfare, enslaved people using knowledge and intelligence tormenting oppressor in ways more effective than violence. They turned Hartwell's own property against him, hidden in very foundations of power, and watched as he destroyed himself trying finding them. James Hartwell's widow, Margaret, interviewed by Henry Whitfield in spring of 1876. She was living in Atlanta by then, remarried to banker named Charles Drummond, trying building life separate from plantation past. When asked about Samuel's revelation, she was quiet long moment before responding. She said she'd always suspected something like this, though never able articulating exactly what. Way search found nothing. Way husband seemed sensing presence without ever locating them. It had felt wrong, she said, like they were being watched by invisible eyes. She'd mentioned this to James several times, but he dismissed concerns as female hysteria, insisting workers had fled and would eventually be found. She also revealed something never told anyone. On several occasions during those 3 months, she'd found small things moved in main house. Book placed differently on shelf, curtain tied back she was certain had been closed, food missing from kitchen in quantities too small noticed and less paying close attention. At times she'd attributed it to own distraction, or servants being careless. Now she understood the 23 had been moving through house at night, taking what needed, leaving traces of presence only someone looking would notice. Margaret also spoke about husband's decline. Obsession with finding missing workers had consumed him, she said, had taken over life-destroying health and relationships. He'd become paranoid, suspicious of everyone, convinced people were lying or hiding information. He'd spent enormous sums on search, neglected plantations operations, driven away friends and family with erratic behavior. By time he died, he was isolated and broken. Man defeated not by violence, but by inability accepting control had been illusion. Revelation of what happened at Riverside had ripple effects throughout Georgia and beyond. It became story told in different communities with different emphasis. In black communities, tale of clever resistance, people using knowledge and patience striking back at oppressors causing no physical violence but inflicting deep psychological wounds. In white communities, often told as cautionary tale about dangers of being too harsh, pushing people to point where they'd risk everything for even small measure of control over lives. Historians and scholars would later debate broader significance of Riverside incident. Some saw isolated event unique to specific circumstances of plantation and 23 individuals. Others argued it represented form of resistance probably more common than historical records suggested. Quiet strategic actions leaving few traces but having profound effects on people involved. Samuel lived another 9 years after revealing story, working at Riverside until death in 1884. At 93, buried in small cemetery near plantation. Grave marked with simple stone bearing name, dates, and single line. He stood his ground. At funeral, attended by both black and white community members, several people spoke about courage, not just in participating in Christmas morning standoff and months of hiding following, but in choosing returning to place where it happened and living out final years on land holding so many painful memories. In decades following, Riverside Plantation changed hands several times. Tunnels beneath buildings eventually sealed in 1890s, deemed unsafe and unnecessary. Main house renovated, modernized, stripped of many original features. By early 20th century, few visible traces remained of what happened there in 1847 and 1848. But story persisted. Passed down through families, both black and white. Each generation adding interpretations and emphasis. Some versions focused on cleverness of plan, way 23 used knowledge of plantation hiding in plain sight. Others emphasized psychological warfare aspect. Way they'd used Hartwell's own obsession against him, watching as he destroyed himself searching. Still others saw spiritual story, demonstration of faith and community transcending physical circumstances of bondage. In 1947, on 100th anniversary of Christmas morning standoff, small ceremony held at Riverside. Descendants of both enslaved workers and Hartwell family attended, gathering impossible just decades earlier. Marker placed near site of old cabins commemorating 23 an act of resistance. Inscription simple. They stood their ground and found their freedom. December 25, 1847. Marker still stands today, though plantation itself subdivided and developed. Houses now occupy land where cotton once grew. Main house, renovated and expanded multiple times, serves as private residence. Tunnels beneath remain sealed, entrances hidden behind modern foundations and landscaping. But people still visit Marker, still tell story, still debate what it means and what lessons hold. What the 23 did on Christmas morning in 1847 was shocking, not because violent or destructive, but because something far more subversive. Demonstration enslaved people could exercise agency, make choices, resist in ways not fitting narratives of either docile submission or violent rebellion dominating discussions of slavery. They didn't attack master. They didn't destroy property. They simply refused working, refused speaking, then disappeared in ways tormenting him far more effectively than physical assault. Psychological impact on James Hartwell profound and lasting. According to family letters preserved in Georgia Historical Society, he never fully recovered from experience. He became paranoid, suspicious of everyone around, convinced other workers on plantation knew more than saying. Health deteriorated, business judgment suffered. Plantation profitable under father and grandfather struggled under increasingly erratic management. He died relatively young, 63, worn down by years of obsession and frustration. But perhaps most significant impact on other enslaved people in region. Word of what happened at Riverside spread quickly, carried by informal networks connecting enslaved communities across South. Story told and retold, adapted and embellished, but always carrying same core message. Resistance possible even in most oppressive circumstances. You didn't have to accept condition as inevitable. Could find ways fighting back using intelligence and patience instead of violence. No way knowing how many other acts of resistance inspired by Riverside incident. Nature of such resistance, quiet, strategic, often invisible to those in power means rarely left historical records. But scholars studying slavery have found hints and suggestions in plantation records, letters, court documents, unexplained disappearances, work slowdowns with no clear cause, masters complaining about sense of unease among workers, feeling something happening beneath surface they couldn't identify. Story of Riverside also challenges common assumptions about what resistance looked like under slavery. Popular imagination often focuses on dramatic rebellions like Nat Turner's or Escape's North via Underground Railroad. These were real and important, but also rare and extremely dangerous. Vast majority of enslaved people never had opportunity participating in such dramatic acts. What they could do was find smaller ways resisting, maintaining humanity and dignity in system designed stripping both away. Christmas morning standoff and months of hiding following represented one such act. Carefully planned demonstration requiring coordination, courage, and understanding of psychology impressing trained strategists. Decision hiding beneath plantation rather than fleeing brilliant in simplicity. It allowed them maintaining resistance for months rather than days. Watching effects of actions, feeling sense of control denied entire lives. Samuel's decision eventually revealing truth also significant. By 1875, when telling story, Civil War had ended slavery, Reconstruction attempted reshaping Southern society. Political and social landscape changed enough that he could speak without fear of returned bondage. But revelation served another purpose. It ensured what 23 did wouldn't be forgotten, wouldn't be reduced to just another mysterious disappearance in historical record. Journalist interviewing Samuel and publishing story noted old man seemed at peace with past. He'd lived through slavery, participated in extraordinary act of resistance, survived seeing freedom, and chosen returning to place where resistance occurred. When asked about regrets, Samuel reportedly said no. Every moment in those tunnels, every night of cold and discomfort, every risk taken, all worth seeing James Hartwell's face that Christmas morning. Watching him realize control was illusion, that people he thought owned had wills and minds and courage never imagined. This mystery shows us most powerful acts of resistance aren't always loudest or most violent. Sometimes they're quiet demonstrations of will forcing those in power confront humanity they've tried denying. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything revealed? Or think there are still secrets buried at Riverside? Leave comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit notification bell, share with someone loving stories making you question what really happened. See you in next video. Legacy of that Christmas morning in 1847 extends far beyond immediate participants and descendants. It became part of larger narrative of resistance to slavery. Narrative historians still working to fully document and understand. For too long, story of slavery told primarily from perspective of those holding power. Plantation owners, politicians, architects of system. Voices of enslaved largely absent, stories lost or deliberately suppressed. But stories like Riverside remind us those voices existed, resistance constant and creative, enslaved people never accepted condition as natural or inevitable. They fought back in ways large and small, using whatever tools and opportunities available. Sometimes meaning running away. Sometimes meaning breaking tools or working slowly. Sometimes meaning preserving cultural traditions and family bonds despite systematic efforts destroying them. And sometimes, as on Christmas morning in 1847, meaning standing silently in yard, refusing moving, refusing speaking, refusing being anything other than human beings making choices. The 23 people standing in yard mostly forgotten now. We know some names. Samuel, Ruth, Thomas, Esther, Benjamin, Clara, Moses, Jacob, but many others lost to history. We don't know what happened to most after leaving Riverside. We don't know if they found freedom seeking, if they built good lives for themselves and families, if they ever spoke about what they'd done on Christmas morning and months following. But we know they existed. We know they made choice shocking Georgia and rippling across South. We know they demonstrated courage and intelligence and refusal accepting roles forced upon them. And we know their story, once revealed, became part of larger story of how enslaved people resisted, survived, and ultimately helped bring down system holding them in bondage. Marker at Riverside stands as testament to courage. But Rail Memorial is story itself, passed through generations, told and retold, each telling adding layers of meaning and interpretation. Story reminding us history more complex than often acknowledge. That people taught seeing as powerless often found ways exercising power. And that most shocking acts sometimes use patience and intelligence instead of violence. What 23 enslaved people did on Christmas morning in 1847 shocked Georgia because it revealed truth those in power didn't want acknowledging. That enslaved people were thinking, planning, strategizing human beings outsmarting masters and resisting oppression in ways both subtle and devastating. They didn't need weapons or violence. They just needed courage, coordination, and deep understanding of psychology of those claiming ownership. And in end, they won. Not in sense of overthrowing system requiring war and decades of struggle, but in sense proving to themselves and others resistance possible, agency existed, more than property masters claimed. They stood ground on Christmas morning, disappeared into tunnels beneath oppressors' feet, and in doing so, found freedom beyond physical escape. They found freedom coming from making own choices. From refusing accepting someone else's definition of who and what you are, from demonstrating human spirit cannot be owned regardless of law. That's what shocked Georgia. Not violence or destruction, but quiet demonstration enslaved people were human beings with wills of own, capable of resistance, strategic, patient, and ultimately more powerful than rebellion. The 23 showed you didn't have accepting oppression, could find ways fighting back even in most impossible circumstances, and sometimes most effective resistance makes oppressor question everything thought they knew about power and control. Their story deserves remembering, not just as historical curiosity, but as testament to human resilience and unbreakable will being free. Deserves telling and retelling, studying and honoring because representing something fundamental about human experience. That people will always find ways resisting dehumanization. That dignity cannot stripped away regardless of oppressive system. And that most powerful acts of defiance often use intelligence and patience rather than force. Tunnels beneath Riverside sealed for over a century now, but remain powerful symbol of what happened there. They represent hidden spaces where resistance planned and executed. Literal underground from which 23 people challenged system claiming ownership. They remind us history has layers, that surface often conceals deeper truths, and most important stories sometimes take decades or centuries fully emerge. Samuel's decision-telling story in 1875 was act of courage in own right. He was old man then, with little losing, but still took risk revealing what happened. Could have taken secret to grave, could have let mystery remain unsolved, could have protected self and others maintaining silence serving them well. But he chose speaking to ensure truth known, making sure what 23 did remembered and understood. His story, published in Atlanta Constitution and reprinted in newspapers across country, sparked conversations about slavery, resistance, nature of power continuing for years. It challenged assumptions, forced people reconsidering what they thought known, added new dimension to ongoing debates about race, freedom, justice reshaping American society in aftermath of Civil War. Story of Riverside also had personal impacts on people hearing it. For descendants of enslaved people, source of pride and inspiration, demonstration ancestors resourceful and courageous, finding ways resisting even in most oppressive circumstances. For descendants of slaveholders, often uncomfortable, forcing confrontation with reality system ancestors built and defended more fragile and contested than taught. Physical. Landscape of Riverside changed dramatically since 1847. Cotton fields replaced by houses and roads. Main house renovated so many times little of original structure remains visible. Cabins where 23 lived long gone, locations marked only by slight ground depressions, occasional artifact turned up by construction or gardening. But story remains embedded in land itself, reminder of what happened there and what it meant. Visitors to Marca today often report feeling sense of presence, connection to past beyond intellectual understanding. Whether genuine spiritual experience or simply power of knowing story debatable, but speaks to enduring impact of what 23 did. Active resistance continues resonating, continues inspiring, continues challenging us thinking about power, freedom, human capacity for courage facing overwhelming oppression. Question Samuel refused answering. What happened to other 22 remains enduring mystery. Did all survive? Did they find freedom and build new lives? Did some die attempting, stories lost to history? We'll probably never know full truth. And perhaps appropriate. Some mysteries meant unsolved. Some secrets meant kept. Privacy of those 22 individuals deserves respect even across gulf of centuries. What we do know is active resistance mattered. Mattered to them, giving sense of agency and dignity systematically denied. Mattered to James Hartwell, destroying peace of mind and contributing to early death. Mattered to other enslaved people hearing story and drawing inspiration. And matters to us today as we continue grappling with legacy of slavery and ongoing struggle for justice and equality. Story of what 23 enslaved people did on Christmas morning in 1847. Ultimately story about power of collective action, importance of strategic thinking, indomitable nature of human spirit. Story deserving remembering, studying, honoring as part of larger narrative of American history. Story challenging us looking beyond simple narratives of oppression and resistance to understand complexity and creativity of how people fought back against dehumanization. And story reminding us most shocking acts sometimes use silence instead of shouting, patience instead of violence, intelligence instead of force. The 23 stood ground, disappeared into darkness beneath oppressors' feet. And in doing so, wrote themselves into history in ways violence never achieved. They shocked Georgia not through destruction, but through demonstration. Demonstration they were human beings with agency, intelligence, and unbreakable will being free. That's legacy of Riverside Plantation. That's what happened on Christmas morning in 1847. And that's why nearly 2 centuries later we're still telling their story.